A Song for Silas by Laurie Wick. Chapter 20. Dear Silas, Baxter is not the same without you. I feel as though you've been gone for months. Josh continually crawls down the hallway to your room and bangs on the closed door. Luke said the extra work from your absence is not nearly as hard as your missed companionship. Enclosed is a letter from Frank Chambers. He wrote while here to deliver the horses and asked me to send it with mine. Frank took the entire first evening of his visit to try and talk Luke into convincing you to go to work for him in Chicago. Luke heard him out, but told Frank in no uncertain terms that the decision was yours and he would not interfere. We, of course, want God's will in this, but the thought of you living elsewhere makes me unhappy. We're praying you will know what to do, for this is the only way you'll be at peace. Please write us. God bless you. Love, Luke, Christine, and Joshua. Dear Si, I saddled my horse today and rode down by the creek. I ended up in the spot where we had that huge mud fight as kids. As I recall, Dad warmed our backsides for that one. Sitting in that spot I missed you so much, I cried. The boys are ready to be out of school for the summer. It shows in their restlessness. Last week, Cal locked Charlie in an old trunk in the barn. Their father found them, and I noticed they both sat down carefully at the supper table that night. I guess things never change. Each generation gets their share of spankings. Max said to tell you Sunday dinner at Graham's is not going to be the same until you come home. If you don't hear from Sue, it's because she isn't feeling very well these days. She hasn't said, but I suspect she's pregnant. Please tell the Nolans that we're praying for all of you and that they can't keep you forever. Love, Julia and family. It was the afternoon of the following day before Silas sat down to read his letters. Silas prayed immediately for Sue and the new life possibly growing within her. She and Mark were so happy together that Silas was sure this would only add to their joy. "O God," Silas prayed in his heart, "another niece or nephew. When, God, when will I have children of my own? Surely this desire to be a husband and father is from you." Silas sat in painful confusion and tried very hard to thank God for the things he had and not the things missing in his life. "Be still and know that I am God." The words came gently to Silas. He wasn't even sure of the reference. Maybe somewhere in the Psalms? For the first time, the words became real for him. God was in control. Be still, for he would have his perfect way. Silas stopped praying. He lay back on his bed and looked toward heaven. Even as he saw the beamed ceiling above him, his heart grew calm and peaceful. God was in control of Grant, Amy, and him. If Amy was meant to live with her father for the rest of her years, then she and Silas would be miserable as husband and wife. If Amy was to be his wife, then God would change her heart, and Silas would have to learn patience. Be still and know that I am God. Please, God, Silas prayed, keep those words before my eyes. Silas lay still for long minutes before he reached for the letter from Frank. He had just started it when Amy called to him. She sounded anxious, and Silas rushed down the stairs. "Oh, Silas, will you help me? Dad has caught a spring cold. He said he would feel better if we put some pillows behind his back." Grant did indeed sound congested, and Silas was glad to do anything to make him more comfortable. Silas was still in the room when Amy left and returned with a large bottle and spoon. Grant ignored the spoon and took 2 healthy swigs. Returning the bottle to Amy's hand, Grant said, "This will put me right. Thanks, honey." Amy followed Silas from the room, taking the bottle with her. Once in the kitchen, Silas noticed she looked a bit pale. He wondered if maybe she was coming down with a cold too. "Are you okay?" "I think so. I'm just a little tired." As Amy spoke, she reached for and began to peel potatoes. Silas was instantly by her side. "Amy, let me get supper so you can rest." "No, Si, you still have the milking to do, and it's not fair that you get your own supper." Silas didn't argue with her, but decided to get the chores and milking done quickly. He could tell Amy needed help, whether she would admit it or not. He checked Grant as he went out and found him soundly sleeping. 2 hours later, Silas was just finishing outside. On this of all nights, when he was in a hurry, everything seemed to go wrong. He'd been kicked twice by an uncooperative cow, and he was not paying attention as he lit a lantern and nearly set the barn ablaze. Those were just a few of the things that delayed his finishing. He moved toward the kitchen, worried for Amy hurrying his steps. Amy was at the stove when he came in. Strangely, she did not have a greeting for him. Silas washed up in record time and went to her side near the stove. She was looking at a large pot and did not acknowledge his presence. "Amy, how are you doing?" She didn't look or reply. "Amy? I can't find my spoon." Silas picked up a large spoon that was sitting very near her hand. Amy's head came up, and after she focused in on the spoon, her face broke into a huge smile. Silas saw that her face was flushed and her eyes too bright. "Amy, I think you're sick. Let me do this." The smile turned instantly into a fierce scowl, and Amy waved the spoon about as she spoke. "I can do it, Silas. It's my kitchen." Silas watched as she thrust the spoon into the pot, nearly submerging her hand, and began to stir vigorously. Silas stood in confusion. Amy was not acting at all like herself, and her speech was slightly slurred. His gaze swung away from her, and his eyes caught something on the kitchen table. The large bottle of medicine was sitting open, with a wet spoon beside it. Silas walked toward the bottle with a sinking heart. His head jerked back in repulsion after waving the bottle beneath his nose. Silas was no judge of liquor, but if smell was any indication, the stuff was 90 proof. Amy was drunk. Silas quickly set the bottle down and returned to the woman at the stove. Her stirring had slowed down to a methodical movement that seemed to be hypnotizing her. He wondered how much she had taken. Silas headed for Grant's room. That girl needed to be in bed, and Silas needed some help, if nothing more than advice. But Grant was sound asleep, out cold. Silas headed back to the kitchen in consternation. He arrived to see Amy lift the pot and nearly scald herself. She righted the pot just in time, but Silas's mind was made up. He gave her no time to protest as he took the spoon and pot from her and began to guide her out of the kitchen. But his touch was too light on her arm, and she easily pulled away from him, saying, as she did, that she must finish supper. At least, that's what it sounded like. Silas tried to reason with her. "Amy, you're sick and you should be in bed." But Amy chose to ignore him and tried to get back to the stove. Silas's next move was to get behind Amy. With his chest to her back and walking slowly, he got her as far as the living room before she turned around, and Silas found himself hugging her. At any other time, hugging Amy would have delighted him, but his skill with inebriated women was non-existent, and he just wanted to see her safely to her room. Amy let out a little squeal when Silas gave in and swung her up into his arms. Her head swam, and she threw her arms around his neck and closed her eyes. She didn't open them until Silas sat her down on the chest at the end of her bed. Silas hunkered down in front of her, and Amy tried to concentrate on what he was saying. Everything felt so warm and fuzzy. "Amy, you need to get ready for bed. I'll get your gown if you tell me where it is." Silas hated even this small intimacy, but he had no choice. Amy continued to look at him with a small smile on her face, so Silas tried again. "Amy, sweetheart, please try." "I love it when you call me sweetheart." Amy's smile grew to just short of a leer. "Oh boy," Silas thought, "I've got to get out of here, or I'm going to kiss her, drunk or not." Silas's hands flew to Amy's shoes, removing them quickly. A fast search of the room produced Amy's robe and nightgown from the hook on the back of the door. When he set the garments beside her, she informed him that some beast was wrapped around her waist. Silas unknotted the apron strings she had been demolishing and pulled her quickly to her feet. He thrust the clothing into her arms and commanded, "Put these on, Amy, now." With that, he exited the room, nearly slamming the door in his haste. Silas leaned back against the closed door and prayed. He heard bumping sounds from in the room, and then Amy broke into song. Silas rolled his eyes toward the ceiling and headed for Grant's room. He was still very deep in sleep. All was quiet in Amy's room as Silas returned to stand outside the door. He waited a moment in indecision, and then quietly opened the door. Amy lay across the bed in her nightgown and robe, humming to herself. She raised her head, and Silas could see she was very sleepy. With utmost care, Silas pulled the covers back and lifted her into his arms. He tucked her within the blankets, robe and all. She was asleep before Silas could straighten. He stood looking at her a moment, wishing he could tell her what was in his heart, before quietly leaving the room.